These were the forgotten guardians of quietude, the masters of discretion, the professionals who understood that sometimes the most powerful work is done when no one is watching, no one is listening, and no one remembers. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the corridors of time, where footsteps are muffled, voices are barely audible, and the most important work happens in the spaces between sounds. Tonight, we explore the quietest professions in history, those mysterious occupations that required not just skill, but the ability to become nearly invisible, nearly silent, nearly ghostly. In the darkness before dawn, when the world still slept and the streets lay empty, they emerged from the shadows like phantoms. The night soil men, or gong farmers, as they were sometimes called, performed one of society's most essential, yet invisible tasks. They moved through medieval cities with an almost supernatural quietness, their wooden carts wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of wheels on cobblestone. Picture London in the 1300s. The city sleeps, but these silent workers navigate narrow alleyways with practiced ease, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on ancient walls. They worked exclusively at night, not just for practical reasons, but because their profession demanded invisibility. Society needed them desperately, yet could not bear to acknowledge their existence in daylight. The most successful night soil men developed an almost mystical ability to move without sound. They learned to read the city's rhythms, to sense when a household was truly asleep, to anticipate the patrol routes of night watchmen. Some claimed they could navigate entire districts in complete darkness, guided only by touch and an intimate knowledge of every stone, every step, every shadowy corner. In Paris, the night soil men formed secretive guilds that passed down techniques through generations. They developed a complex system of silent signals, a particular way of tapping on a door, a specific arrangement of stones that indicated when a house was ready for their services. These men became so adept at their silent craft that urban legends grew around them. People whispered that they could walk through walls, that they knew every secret of the sleeping city. The strangest part of their profession was the rule of absolute silence during work hours. Speaking above a whisper could mean losing one's position, and in medieval times, this specialized work was often hereditary, passed from father to son through hushed conversations in candlelit workshops. They developed their own form of sign language, a way of communicating complex instructions without making a sound. Records from the time describe how these workers would sometimes disappear for days at a time, emerging from the underground networks of medieval cities, like spirits returning from another world. They knew passages beneath the streets that no one else remembered, medieval tunnels that connected different districts, forgotten crypts beneath churches where they could rest unseen during the day. Some night soil men claimed to have witnessed things that others never saw: secret meetings in abandoned buildings, mysterious figures moving through the pre-dawn darkness, conversations that revealed the hidden political machinations of their time. But bound by their profession's code of silence, these secrets died with them, buried as quietly as they had lived. Along the ancient Silk Road, stretching from Constantinople to Beijing, there existed a particular class of merchants who dealt in the most precious and dangerous commodities of their time. These were the quiet traders, men and women who understood that their survival depended not on loud proclamations of their wares, but on the ability to move through hostile territories like whispers on the wind. These merchants developed an almost supernatural ability to assess danger through silence. They could read the mood of a caravanserai by the quality of quiet, whether it was the peaceful silence of safety or the tense silence of hidden threat. They learned to communicate with their customers through subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and the barely audible rustle of silk being unfolded in candlelit chambers. In the markets of Samarkand, these silent merchants would appear just before dawn, setting up their stalls with movements so practiced and quiet that they seemed to materialize from the morning mist. They dealt in goods that required discretion: rare spices that could be used as poisons, precious stones that might attract unwanted attention, and sometimes information that was worth more than gold. The most successful of these merchants developed a reputation for knowing things that others did not. They could sense political changes before they happened, predict which trade routes would become dangerous, and identify which customers could be trusted with their most valuable goods. This knowledge came from their mastery of silence, the ability to listen to conversations without being noticed, to observe without being seen, to remember without being remembered. Some of these merchants claimed to have learned their skills from the Buddhist monks they encountered along the trade routes. These monks, who had taken vows of silence, taught them that true understanding came not from speaking, but from listening not just to words, but to the spaces between words, the breath between sentences, the meaning that existed in pure silence. The most mysterious of these silent merchants were known as shadow traders. They appeared in historical records only as brief mentions in customs documents or passing references in travelers' journals. They seemed to exist in the margins of the commercial world, dealing in goods that no one else would touch, serving customers who preferred to remain anonymous. Legends spoke of shadow traders who could cross vast distances without leaving any trace of their passage, who knew secret routes through mountain passes that didn't appear on any map, who could disappear into the crowd of any city market, as if they had never existed. Some claimed they were not entirely human, that they had learned their silent skills from the spirits of the desert, the ghosts of ancient caravan routes. In feudal Japan, during the Edo period, there existed a class of intelligence gatherers so skilled in the art of invisibility that most people never suspected their existence. The onmitsu were not the dramatic ninja of popular imagination, but rather masters of blending into everyday life, of becoming so unremarkable that they became invisible. These men and women took on the identities of the most mundane professions: traveling merchants, wandering priests, itinerant artisans. But their true skill lay in their ability to gather information through patient observation and careful listening. They could spend months in a single location, slowly building trust, gradually becoming part of the community's daily rhythm, all while remaining completely silent about their true purpose. The onmitsu understood that the most valuable information was often found in the quiet moments in the conversations people had when they thought no one was listening, in the letters they wrote when they believed no one would read them, in the small details of daily life that revealed larger truths about loyalty, rebellion, and political change. Their training was rigorous and deeply psychological. They learned to suppress their own personalities so completely that they could inhabit their cover identities for years at a time. Some onmitsu became so skilled at their roles that they seemed to forget their original identities entirely, becoming ghosts of themselves, shadows of shadows. The most skilled onmitsu developed an almost supernatural ability to read human nature. They could predict how people would behave in certain situations, could sense when someone was lying, could identify potential threats or allies through subtle observations of posture, breathing, and the quality of silence in a room. Records from the period describe onmitsu who could remain motionless for hours, hidden in plain sight, observing and memorizing every detail of their surroundings. They learned to control their breathing so completely that they could slow their heartbeat, reduce their body temperature, and enter a state of consciousness that was almost death-like in its stillness. Some onmitsu claimed to have achieved a state of perfect invisibility not through magic, but through such complete understanding of human perception that they could position themselves in the blind spots of awareness, moving through crowded spaces without being noticed, standing in rooms where conversations continued as if they weren't there. The strangest accounts describe onmitsu who had been undercover for so long that they had become more like the people they were pretending to be than their original selves. They had married, raised families, and lived entire lives in their assumed identities, all while maintaining their silent vigil, their secret purpose known only to themselves and their long-dead handlers. In the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, There worked a particular class of monks who had dedicated their lives to the preservation of knowledge through absolute silence. These hermit scribes took vows that went beyond the normal monastic commitment to quiet. They pledged to spend their entire lives in complete vocal silence, communicating only through their careful, methodical copying of ancient texts. Picture the monastery of St. Gaul in Switzerland, circa 900 CE. In a chamber lit only by candles and the pale light filtering through narrow windows, these silent scribes worked from dawn until dusk, their quill pens moving across parchment with a rhythm as steady as heartbeats. The only sounds were the scratch of pen on paper, the whisper of turning pages, and the distant chanting from the chapel, a sonic environment so consistent that it became a form of silence itself. These scribes developed an almost mystical relationship with the texts they copied. Spending years transcribing the same manuscript, they claimed to enter a state of consciousness where they became one with the words, where their hands moved independently of their minds, where the ancient authors seemed to guide their pens directly. Some reported experiencing visions while copying, seeing the original authors standing beside them, whispering corrections and additions that didn't appear in any known manuscript. The most dedicated hermit scribes lived in cells so small that they could barely lie down, spending 16 hours a day hunched over their writing desks. They developed a form of meditative copying that was said to induce trance-like states, where time seemed to stop and the boundary between the scribe and the text disappeared entirely. In these states, they claimed to understand languages they had never learned, to see meanings in texts that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Their work was so precise and methodical that each scribe developed a unique style that was instantly recognizable to others in their profession. They could identify the work of a specific scribe from a single word, could tell whether a manuscript had been copied during illness or health, in summer or winter, in peace or during times of war. This intimate knowledge of their craft created an unspoken community of silent workers who knew each other only through their handwriting. The hermit scribes preserved not just the texts themselves, but the silence in which they were created. They believed that knowledge absorbed in complete quiet was different from knowledge gained through discussion or debate, that silence allowed the true meaning of texts to emerge, uncontaminated by the noise of contemporary interpretation. Some of these scribes claimed to have copied texts that no longer existed anywhere else, manuscripts that had been lost in fires or wars, preserved only in the perfect silence of their memory. They would spend years reconstructing these lost works from memory alone, creating new manuscripts of ancient texts through a process that seemed more like channeling than copying. The strangest accounts describe scribes who had been silent for so long that they had forgotten how to speak, who communicated only through writing, who had become so attuned to the rhythm of copying that they could work in complete darkness, their hands guided by muscle memory and something approaching supernatural intuition. Within the walls of the Ottoman imperial palace, there existed a class of women whose power came not from their voices, but from their ability to listen, to observe, and to understand the complex web of relationships that governed the empire. These were the palace mutes, women who had been rendered voiceless, either by choice or by force, but who wielded enormous influence through their mastery of silent communication. These women developed a sophisticated system of non-verbal communication that was more complex than any spoken language. They could conduct detailed conversations through eye movements, subtle hand gestures, and the positioning of their bodies in space. Their silence was not empty, but full of meaning, pregnant with information that could determine the fate of the empire. The palace mutes became the keepers of the Sultan's deepest secrets, the guardians of information too dangerous to be spoken aloud. They witnessed private conversations between rulers and advisors, observed the intimate moments of royal families, and remembered every detail with photographic precision. Their silence was their protection, and their power they could never be forced to testify, never be made to reveal what they had seen. Some of these women claimed to have developed an almost telepathic ability to understand the thoughts and intentions of others. They could read the subtle signs of facial expression, body language, and breathing patterns that revealed hidden emotions, secret fears, and unspoken desires. This skill made them invaluable as advisors and confidants, despite or perhaps because of their inability to speak. The most skilled of the palace mutes were said to move through the palace like ghosts, their footsteps making no sound on marble floors, their silk garments rustling no louder than whispers. They could appear in rooms without being noticed, disappear from conversations without being missed, and position themselves to observe crucial meetings without being seen. Their training was rigorous and mysterious. New mutes were taught by older women who had mastered the art of silent communication, learning not just the gestures and signs, but the deeper discipline of reading human nature through observation alone. They learned to control their own expressions so completely that their faces became masks, revealing nothing while seeing everything. Records from the period describe palace mutes who seemed to know about events before they happened, who could predict political changes through subtle shifts in behavior among the palace officials, who could sense danger through changes in the quality of silence in the palace corridors. Some claimed they had developed a sixth sense for detecting lies, betrayal, and hidden intentions. The strangest accounts tell of palace mutes who had been silent for so long that they had transcended normal human limitations, who could communicate with each other across vast distances through methods that seemed supernatural, who knew things that no human observation could have revealed. They had become, in essence, the living memory of the empire, preserving its secrets in the perfect silence of their minds. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, during the Islamic Golden Age, there worked a group of scholars who conducted their most important research in the deep hours of the night, when the city slept and the world was silent. These midnight, mathematicians believed that mathematical truth could only be discovered in perfect quiet, that numbers revealed their secrets only to those who approached them in silence. These scholars developed a practice of mathematical meditation that required absolute silence. They would work alone in candlelit chambers, surrounded by scrolls covered in equations and geometric diagrams, entering trance-like states where they claimed to see mathematical relationships that were invisible to the normal mind. Their work was done in complete solitude, with no discussion or collaboration, because they believed that mathematical truth was too pure to be contaminated by human conversation. The midnight mathematicians made discoveries that wouldn't be understood by European scholars for centuries. They solved problems in algebra and geometry that had puzzled mathematicians since ancient times, developed new systems of notation that made complex calculations possible, and created mathematical proofs that seemed to emerge from pure intuition rather than logical deduction. Their method was deeply mystical. They would spend hours in silent contemplation of a single equation, allowing their consciousness to merge with the mathematical relationships they were studying. In these states, they claimed to experience mathematical truth as a form of divine revelation, where the structure of the universe revealed itself through numbers and geometric forms. The most skilled of these mathematicians developed an ability to perform incredibly complex calculations in their heads, working through problems that would normally require hours of written work through pure mental visualization. They could see mathematical relationships in their minds like architects seeing buildings, manipulating abstract concepts as if they were physical objects. Some claimed to have achieved a state of mathematical consciousness where they could perceive the underlying mathematical structure of reality itself. They spoke of seeing the equations that governed the movement of stars, the geometric patterns that determined the growth of plants, the numerical relationships that shaped human behavior and historical events. Their work was so advanced and so abstracted from normal human experience that it seemed almost supernatural. They developed mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, created proofs that used reasoning so subtle that later scholars couldn't understand how they had arrived at their conclusions. The strangest accounts describe midnight mathematicians who had become so immersed in their silent study that they seemed to exist more in the realm of pure mathematical abstraction than in the physical world. They could go for days without eating, sustained only by their contemplation of mathematical beauty, living in a state of consciousness that was closer to mystical experience than to normal human awareness. In the great library of Alexandria, before its destruction, there worked a class of librarians who were responsible for the most dangerous and mysterious texts in the ancient world. These were the Silent Keepers librarians who had taken vows of secrecy, so absolute that they could never discuss their work, even with other librarians, even with the scholars who came seeking knowledge. These librarians were responsible for texts that were considered too dangerous for general circulation, works on forbidden magic, political treatises that could topple governments, scientific discoveries that challenged religious orthodoxy, and philosophical works that questioned the very nature of reality. Their job was not just to preserve these texts, but to protect society from knowledge that could be destructive if it fell into the wrong hands. The Silent Keepers developed an elaborate system of coded catalogs that only they could read, ensuring that the most dangerous texts remained hidden while still being accessible to those who truly needed them. They could identify the character and intentions of scholars through careful observation, determining who could be trusted with dangerous knowledge and who should be turned away. Their work required not just scholarly expertise, but deep psychological insight. They had to understand not just what the texts contained, but what effect that knowledge would have on different types of minds. They became experts in human nature, able to predict how different people would react to dangerous ideas, who would use knowledge wisely, and who would abuse it. The most skilled of the Silent Keepers claimed to have read texts that no longer existed anywhere else in the world, to have memorized works that had been deliberately destroyed, to carry in their minds the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had been lost to war and time. They were living libraries, walking repositories of knowledge that existed nowhere else. Some of these librarians developed an almost supernatural ability to find exactly the text that a scholar needed, even when the scholar couldn't articulate what they were looking for. They seemed to understand the deeper patterns of knowledge, the hidden connections between different areas of learning, the secret relationships that linked all human understanding. Records from the period describe Silent Keepers who could work in complete darkness, who had memorized the location of every text in the library, who could navigate the vast collection through touch and intuition alone. They moved through the library like ghosts, appearing when needed, disappearing when their work was done, maintaining their vigil in perfect silence. The strangest accounts tell of Silent Keepers who claimed to have achieved a state of consciousness where they could access the knowledge contained in texts without actually reading them, who could absorb information directly from scrolls through some form of mental osmosis, who had become so attuned to the library that they could sense when texts were being damaged or stolen, even from great distances. Along the coasts of ancient Japan, there existed a tradition of fishing that was conducted in complete silence, in the darkest hours of the night, by fishermen who had dedicated their lives to understanding the secret rhythms of the sea. These night fishermen, or Yami no Surishi, believed that fish could sense human presence through sound and vibration, and that the most valuable catch could only be taken in perfect quiet. These fishermen developed techniques that seemed almost supernatural. They could navigate treacherous coastlines in complete darkness, reading the water through subtle changes in sound and movement. They learned to predict weather patterns through the quality of silence in the air, to sense the presence of fish through vibrations felt through their feet, to communicate with their boats through gestures visible only to eyes trained in darkness. The night fishermen worked alone, in boats so small and quiet that they seemed to glide across the water like leaves on the wind. They used fishing techniques that had been passed down through generations, methods that required such precise timing and such intimate knowledge of fish behavior that they seemed more like hunting than fishing. Their work was deeply meditative. They would spend hours in perfect stillness, their lines in the water, their consciousness merged with the rhythm of the waves. In these states, they claimed to develop an almost telepathic connection with the fish, able to sense their movements and intentions through subtle changes in the tension of their lines. The most skilled night fishermen could predict the exact moment when a fish would bite, could tell the size and species of a fish from the way it fought, could navigate to specific fishing spots in complete darkness with an accuracy that seemed impossible. They developed a form of silent communication with the sea itself, reading its moods and responding to its changes with intuitive precision. Some night fishermen claimed to have encountered strange phenomena during their silent vigils, mysterious lights beneath the water, sounds that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean, glimpses of creatures that didn't match any known species. They spoke of entering altered states of consciousness during their long hours of silent fishing, where the boundary between themselves and the sea seemed to dissolve. The tradition was so demanding that few could master it. It required not just skill and knowledge, but a particular type of temperament that could endure long hours of solitude, silence, and darkness. Those who succeeded claimed to have achieved a form of enlightenment through their practice, a deep understanding of the natural world that came only through perfect quiet and patient observation. The strangest accounts describe night fishermen who had been practicing their craft for so long that they seemed to have become part of the sea itself, who could predict storms days in advance, who knew the location of fish with such accuracy that they never returned empty-handed, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the hidden patterns of the ocean. During the Great Plague outbreaks of medieval Europe, there emerged a profession so grim and necessary that it was practiced only by those who had already accepted their own death. The plague walkers, or mort collectors, moved through infected cities in the dead of night, their footsteps muffled by cloth wrappings, their presence announced only by the soft ringing of a small bell that warned the living to stay away. These men and women developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate plague-stricken cities without becoming infected themselves. They learned to read the signs of disease through subtle changes in the air, to sense the presence of death through variations in smell and sound, to move through contaminated areas with a precision that seemed to transcend normal human awareness. The plague walkers worked in complete isolation, unable to return to their families or communities, living in temporary shelters outside the city walls. They communicated with the authorities through written notes left at designated locations, receiving their instructions through the same silent system. Their work was so dangerous that they were considered already dead by the society they served. Their methodology was deeply ritualistic. They would begin their work at midnight, moving through the streets in a predetermined pattern, checking houses marked with the sign of infection, collecting the dead with movements that had become automatic through repetition. They worked in silence not just to avoid disturbing the living, but because they believed that the spirits of the dead could be summoned by careless words. The most experienced plague walkers claimed to have developed an ability to sense the presence of disease before it became visible, to predict which areas of a city would be infected next, to identify people who were carrying the plague before they showed any symptoms. This knowledge was gained through years of silent observation, of learning to read the subtle signs that preceded the outbreak of disease. Some plague walkers reported strange experiences during their work, visions of the dead, voices calling from empty houses, glimpses of figures that disappeared when approached directly. They spoke of entering a state of consciousness where they existed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, where normal human concerns seemed distant and irrelevant. Their work was so psychologically demanding that many plague walkers developed a form of mystical detachment from normal human experience. They described feeling as if they were already ghosts, as if their physical bodies were merely tools for completing a task that transcended normal human understanding. The strangest accounts describe plague walkers who had been working for so long that they seemed to have become immune not just to disease, but to normal human emotions and needs. They could work for days without rest, could handle the most horrific scenes without emotional reaction, could navigate the city of the dead with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. In the imperial workshops of ancient China, there worked a class of artisans whose craft required such perfect silence that they were said to be able to hear their own heartbeats. These were the mirror polishers, whose job was to create bronze mirrors so perfect that they could reflect not just physical images, but the spiritual essence of the person looking into them. The mirror polishers believed that metal could sense human emotion and intention, that the quality of a mirror's reflection was affected by the state of mind of the person who created it. They worked in chambers that were isolated from all sound, where even the slightest noise could, according to their beliefs, introduce flaws into the mirror's surface. Their technique was meditative and deeply spiritual. They would spend hours in silent contemplation before beginning work, clearing their minds of all thoughts and emotions, achieving a state of perfect inner stillness before touching the bronze. The actual polishing was done in a trance-like state, where their hands moved with mechanical precision while their consciousness remained perfectly calm. The most skilled mirror polishers could work for days without breaking their concentration, polishing a single mirror with thousands of tiny, precise movements, each one performed with exactly the same pressure and exactly the same rhythm. They claimed to enter a state where they became one with the metal, where they could sense the internal structure of the bronze and respond to its needs with intuitive precision. These artisans developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the quality of reflection. They could detect flaws in a mirror's surface that were invisible to normal eyes, could predict how a mirror would age over time, could tell whether a mirror had been polished correctly just by looking at it from across a room. Some mirror polishers claimed to have created mirrors that showed not just the physical appearance of the person looking into them, but their true nature, their hidden thoughts, their spiritual condition. These mirrors were said to be so perfect that they could reveal truths that the person themselves didn't know, making them too dangerous for normal use. The work was so demanding that it could only be performed by those who had achieved a particular type of spiritual discipline. Many mirror polishers were also practitioners of meditation and martial arts, using their craft as a form of spiritual practice that led to higher states of consciousness. The strangest accounts describe mirror polishers who had achieved such perfect control over their craft that they could create mirrors that seemed to have magical properties, mirrors that showed the future, mirrors that could communicate with spirits, mirrors that revealed the location of hidden treasures or the truth about distant events. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, there worked a class of monks whose craft was so intimately connected with prayer and meditation that they were said to infuse their candles with spiritual power. These candle makers, or curari, worked in complete silence, believing that any sound during the creation process would diminish the candle's ability to carry prayers to heaven. The monastic candle makers developed techniques that seemed to transcend normal craftsmanship. They could judge the quality of wax through touch alone, could predict how a candle would burn by examining the wick, could create candles that burned with flames so steady and pure that they seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal physical laws. Their work was deeply ritualistic. They would begin each day with hours of silent prayer, preparing their minds and souls for the sacred work of creating light. The actual candle making was performed in a meditative state, where every movement was deliberate and meaningful, where the creation of each candle was treated as an act of worship. The most skilled curari claimed to have achieved a state of consciousness where they could sense the spiritual properties of different types of wax, could create candles that would burn for specific periods of time, could infuse their candles with particular spiritual qualities depending on their intended use. These candle makers were responsible for creating the candles used in the most sacred religious ceremonies, candles that had to burn without flickering during crucial moments of worship, candles that were believed to carry the prayers of the faithful directly to God. The quality of their work was considered so important that a poorly made candle could invalidate an entire religious service. Some Chirari reported experiencing visions while working, seeing angels guiding their hands, hearing divine voices providing instruction on the proper techniques for creating sacred light. They spoke of entering a state where they became instruments of divine will, where their craft was performed not by their own skill, but by spiritual forces working through them. The work required not just technical expertise, but a particular type of spiritual sensitivity. The candle makers had to be able to sense the spiritual needs of those who would use their candles, creating different types of candles for different purposes: candles for prayer, candles for healing, candles for protection against evil. The strangest accounts describe Chirari who had become so attuned to their craft that they could create candles that seemed to have supernatural properties, candles that burned with different colored flames, candles that could burn underwater, candles that would only ignite in the presence of true faith. In the imperial courts of ancient China, there existed a profession that elevated the simple act of preparing tea into a form of silent meditation that was said to reveal the deepest truths about human nature. These tea masters, or cha shi, worked in complete silence, believing that the quality of tea was affected by the state of mind of the person who prepared it. The tea masters developed techniques that seemed to transcend normal culinary skills. They could judge the quality of tea leaves through subtle differences in color and texture, could predict the perfect brewing temperature through the sound of water heating, could time the steeping process with such precision that each cup achieved the perfect balance of flavor and strength. Their work was performed in specially designed tea houses that were isolated from all external noise, where even the sound of footsteps was muffled by thick carpets and soft furnishings. The tea masters moved through their preparation ritual with movements so smooth and controlled that they seemed to float rather than walk. The most skilled tea masters claimed to have achieved a state of consciousness where they could sense the mood and temperament of the person who would drink the tea, adjusting their preparation technique to create the perfect cup for each individual. They could create tea that would calm anxiety, inspire creativity, or promote deep meditation. These artisans believed that tea was a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, that the act of preparing and drinking tea could induce states of consciousness that were otherwise difficult to achieve. They developed specific techniques for creating tea that would enhance different types of mental activity: tea for scholars, tea for artists, tea for spiritual seekers. Some tea masters reported experiencing profound spiritual insights during their work, claiming to enter states of consciousness where they could perceive the true nature of reality, where the boundaries between self and world dissolved completely. They spoke of achieving enlightenment through the simple act of preparing tea with perfect attention and perfect silence. The work required not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of human psychology and spiritual practice. The tea masters had to be able to read the subtle signs of their guests' emotional and spiritual states, creating tea experiences that would address their specific needs and concerns. The strangest accounts describe tea masters who had achieved such perfect mastery of their craft that they could create tea that seemed to have magical properties, tea that could heal physical ailments, tea that enhanced psychic abilities, tea that could induce prophetic dreams or visions of the future. As we reach the end of our journey through history's quietest professions, we find ourselves in a place of profound stillness. These forgotten workers, these masters of silence, these guardians of the unseen, they remind us that some of the most important work in human history has been done not in the bright light of public attention, but in the shadows, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between sounds. They understood something that our modern world has largely forgotten: that silence is not empty, but full of possibility. That the most profound truths are often discovered not through speaking, but through listening. That the most essential work is sometimes done by those who leave no trace, who work without recognition, who labor in the darkness, so that others might live in the light. These quiet professionals developed skills that seem almost supernatural to our modern minds: the ability to read human nature through subtle observation, to work with such precision that they seem to transcend normal human limitations, to exist in states of consciousness that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their stories remind us that throughout history, there have always been those who chose the path of silence, who found meaning and purpose in work that others couldn't see or understand. They were the keepers of secrets, the guardians of knowledge, the silent witnesses to the great drama of human civilization. As you drift toward sleep, imagine these quiet workers moving through the corridors of time, the night soilmen navigating medieval streets, the onmitsu blending invisibly into feudal communities, the plague walkers moving through infected cities, the mirror polishers creating perfect reflections in silent workshops. They are still there, in the spaces between history's louder moments, continuing their quiet work, maintaining their silent vigil. In a world that grows ever louder, ever more connected, ever more filled with noise and distraction, perhaps there is something we can learn from these masters of silence. Perhaps there is wisdom in their understanding that the most important work is sometimes done in quiet, that the most profound truths are discovered in stillness, that the most essential service is sometimes performed by those who ask for nothing in return but the privilege of working in peace. Sleep well, knowing that throughout history, there have always been those who kept watch in the silence, who maintained the quiet spaces where important work could be done, who understood that sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that cannot be seen, cannot be heard, but is always there, always working, always keeping the world turning in its mysterious, silent way. The quiet professionals of history remind us that silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything, all the possibilities, all the potential, all the profound truths that exist in the spaces between words, in the moments between actions, in the eternal stillness that underlies all motion, all noise, all the busy surface of human life. They are with us still, these quiet workers, these masters of silence, these guardians of the unseen. In every quiet moment, in every pause between words, in every instant of stillness, they continue their work, maintaining the silent foundation upon which all human civilization rests. Rest now, and let their silence carry you into peaceful dreams, where the noise of the world fades away, and only the essential truths remain, whispered in the language that needs no words, understood in the silence that speaks louder than any sound.